Hey, hello everyone. Welcome to another session of the Leuven Seminar in Classical German Philosophy. Today we are very happy to welcome Corey Dyck for the launch of his new book on Wolff and the German metaphysical tradition. Just before I introduce Corey and his respondents or commentators, I'd like to invite everyone to switch on your cameras, if possible, of course. It's not mandatory, but we kindly invite you to do so in order to emulate the atmosphere of an in-person seminar. So today we are very happy to welcome Corey Dyck, who is Professor of Philosophy at the University of Western Ontario. Corey has published extensively on different figures of German metaphysical tradition, Wolff, Leibniz, but also on Kant. I would like to mention among his publication, his book on Kant and rational psychology from 2014. Also, he's one of the editors of the volume Women and Philosophy in 18th Century Germany, both of them published by Oxford University Press. And he's the author of the book that is the reason of our session today, Wolff and the First 15 Years of German Metaphysics, published by Oxford University Press as well, last year, toward the end of last year, if I'm right. If you're interested in buying the book, you will find a discount flyer in the website of our seminar, so please feel free to look at the website for the discount flyer. The format of the session will be the following. Corey will present his book, the main points of his proposal in the book for about 10-15 minutes. And then we will hear each of the respondents dealing with specific chapters of the book. The commentators, the respondents commentators today are Pier Paolo Betti, Tinka Prunea Bretonet, Paula Rumore, and Reed Vinegar, and I will present each of them before it's their turn to speak. So we'll hear each one of the speakers, then Corey will have 5-10 minutes to respond to each of them, and then we will open the floor for a Q&A. And after the Q&A, we will leave the Zoom meeting open for a more informal conversation without the recording. So we are invited to stay to share this moment with us as well. I think this is all. I would like to thank again Corey and the commentators for accepting our invitation to this book launch. And Corey, the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks, Manuel, for the introduction. I'll begin by just thanking the organizers and host for this lovely seminar. Thanks to Karin, thanks to Raphael, and thanks to Manuel for chairing it. Thanks as well to the speakers for taking the time to read through the book. I appreciate, I look forward to their other comments. And thanks to a bunch of folks in this room, including some of the speakers who helped to contribute to the research that went into to this book. So that includes Paula, that includes Tinka, that includes Matteo, who I just saw join, that includes Colin as well. So a lot of the folks in this room actually contributed to me completing this project. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen here. Where I have a brief PowerPoint presentation that, as Manuel indicated, just goes over some of the kind of high-level themes of the book. So here's the, if you haven't seen it already, there's the front page of the book, the book cover. As many of you, I'm sure, know, this is just a colorized version of the original frontispiece for Wolff's German Metaphysics. I chose it not only because I thought it would look attractive and because a lot of the other good Wolff paintings were taken by other volumes, but also because I think that it, I mean, and this is well known too, that this illustrates quite literally the kind of, the enlightening intentions of Wolff's text in German Metaphysics. He's literally trying to clear things up when it comes to German philosophy. And in the end, this book is really an attempt to do justice to Wolff's place with the German metaphysics in particular in the history of 18th century German philosophy. So I begin by recounting some of the events from the 12th of November in 1723. As Wolff was preparing for a lecture on natural philosophy that evening, the university secretary and a member of the academic senate delivered a decree that had just been received in Halle. The decree was issued by Friedrich Wilhelm I, and it ordered Wolff removed from his professorial chair in Halle and exiled from the land of Brandenburg, Prussia within 48 hours on pain of hanging. And Wolff didn't waste much time in responding. He took leave of his two closest colleagues, with one of his colleagues saying that he was shocked at the order, but said that he would just wash his hands of the matter. And this kind of betrayal by a close friend of Wolff's made him so upset that he actually became physically ill at that moment. But in any case, within 12 hours of receiving the order, Wolff left Halle for neighboring Saxony, which, as it happens, was just across the river, just across the Saale River and into Passendale. But he paused to reimburse his students their fees for his undelivered lectures, and then eventually made his way to his next university appointment at Marburg. So Wolff's exile was the climax, if not the finale, of a controversy with his pietist colleagues in the Faculty of Theology, in particular with August Hermann Francke and Joachim Lange. They had most recently taken exception to Wolff's contention in his prorectoral address that Chinese Confucians served as an example of the attainability of moral and civic virtue, even in the absence of belief in Christian religion. They had managed, the pietists, since Wolff's delivery of that lecture, to prevail on the king that Wolff's views were inconsistent with Christian beliefs and even posed a threat to the stability of the kingdom. And at the bottom of the order, the Friedrich Wilhelm I himself wrote in German, "Ich hab das nicht wusst, dass der Wolff so gottlose war." So I didn't know that Wolff was so godless, but the pietists apparently had convinced him of the fact. However, their opposition to Wolff was initially, right, so in spite of this all coming to a head with the prorectoral address in the aftermath, the pietist opposition to Wolff was, or at least I contend, initially provoked by his Deutsche Metaphysik, the German metaphysics of 1719, 1720, and by the harmful philosophical doctrines that Wolff defended there, which the pietists deemed false and harmful. So among the metaphysical views that they took issue with were Wolff's compatibilist account of freedom, his demonstration of the causal concatenation of all events in the world, and the intellectualist conception of God and novel proof of his existence, all of which conflicted with deeply held pietist intellectual commitments. The controversy that ensued turned on the definition and demonstration of the freedom of the will, where charges of materialism and idealism, fatalism and atheism were consistently leveled, and all of this with the specter of Spinoza looming in the background. So given all this, one might expect that such a dispute would be recognized as a textbook example of a philosophical controversy, that its impact on the development of German philosophy in the 18th century had been thoroughly examined by historians of philosophy. Yet with only a few exceptions, these expectations are actually disappointed. Right? Instead, the philosophical elements in the controversy between Wolff and the pietists are taken as little more than window dressing, as a kind of intellectual cover for the deeper personal conflicts and professional rivalries that really drove the respective parties. Right? And so the philosophical character of the controversy is minimized or dismissed entirely. And there are, as far as I can tell, three principal reasons for why this controversy has not been accorded its rightful place in the history of German philosophy in the 18th century, right? So we talk about the Pantheismus-Streit, the atheism controversy, sometimes even the Fragmentenstreit as an intellectual or philosophical dispute, but this one isn't accorded the same status in the history of 18th century German philosophy. And so there's three reasons why I think that's the case. And the first is a low estimation of Wolff's merits as a philosopher. And this is particularly insofar as he's regarded as a kind of mere systematizer of Leibniz. And indeed, Wolff's metaphysics quite deliberately incorporates and engages with core aspects of what was known at the time of Leibniz's metaphysics. The second is a dim view of the pietists' philosophical bona fides. Right? The pietists undoubtedly, and indeed shamelessly, harbored a profound skepticism regarding the depth and extent of insight that human reason was capable of. And in this context, they unsurprisingly took up a position closer to Luther than to their colleagues in the philosophy faculty. Right? So Luther quite famously talks about reason and philosophy as the devil's whore. It's not surprising that what is in essence a Lutheran movement would side closer to Luther than to their colleagues in philosophy on the question of the utility of philosophy. The third reason concerns the controversy itself, which was fraught with personal and professional rivalries and produced little of obvious philosophical substance. Right, so there's no question that personal differences and professional boundary policing contributed plenty of oxygen to the fire. Right, so there was at one point a dispute over the appointment of Lange's son to a position in the philosophy department. There was all sorts of professional differences relating to the boundaries of the faculties and their authority to censor the others. There was disputes over students, right? Lange was teaching, but his benches were emptying in favor of attending Wolff's lectures, right? So there's all of these other sorts of things beside and around the philosophical issues of debate. And as for the writings generated in the course of the controversy by the main belligerents, their overall intellectual quality, I think, flatters neither side. And given the high philosophical interest then and today in the core topics at issue, right, things like the PSR, principles of sufficient reason, the nature of freedom, etc., right, their writings cannot be read without a certain disappointment that neither party ever really rose to the occasion to pen a lasting contribution on these topics. Right, so these are three reasons for the neglect of this controversy, and I think that to some extent these reasons are well motivated. But I think that all of this can be admitted while denying that it gets to the heart of the matter, right? This can all be admitted, and still we can contend for the philosophical interest of this dispute. So beginning with Wolff, I think he is the most misunderstood philosopher of note in the entire 18th century. This misunderstanding is nowhere more evident than in the reception of his metaphysics. But I take it that this misunderstanding is the result of a failure to appreciate the wider context of Wolff's German metaphysics, and a failure to appreciate Wolff's engagement with a constellation of modern philosophers and scientists, with Leibniz being only one voice among many. Turning to the pietists, while much has been made of their alleged hostility towards reason, there has been little effort to understand the intellectual underpinnings of the movement itself, and to consider their critiques of Enlightenment rationality in terms of them. But once this is done, one sees that the pietists differ from their opponents concerning the priority and not the value of philosophy. They don't contend for a wholesale rejection of philosophy, but rather for a specific conception of its utility as only a part of the whole of human intellectual and spiritual endeavor. Right? So they're in fact much less hostile to philosophy than Luther was. And indeed, they accord an important place to philosophy in education, even for theologians. But they regard Wolff's philosophical system as representing an abuse of the purpose of philosophy. And finally, relating to the confrontation between Wolff and the pietists, I think it would be uncharitable to limit its significance to the many texts exchanged in the course of the controversy. Instead, I take it that the significance of the dispute lies in the fact that the two sides articulated diametrically opposed philosophical positions, which came to serve as the fixed frame for metaphysical discussion in Germany for the remainder of the first half of the 18th century. Right, so my point here is just that focusing too much on the actual papers exchanged by Wolff and by Lange in the aftermath of the controversy distracts from the real philosophical interest of the dispute and its impact. Okay, and so just quickly by way of finishing up here, I'll just go quickly through each of the parts and chapters of the text itself. So in any case, all this is what I hope to show in the book. And obviously at the center of these developments is Wolff's Deutsche Metaphysik. And one of the principal tasks of the study is to offer an accurate and detailed account of its contributions to metaphysics. And this is what I undertake in the first three chapters of the book, which constitute part one, and which together, I think, offer an unprecedentedly comprehensive consideration of Wolff's text. So chapter one begins by exploring the context of Wolff's metaphysics and his early methodological, philosophical, and scientific writings. It also documents how Wolff was influenced throughout by a variety of modern philosophers, including Leibniz, of course, but also and importantly, figures like Tschirnhaus, like Locke, and Newton, and Malebranche, and others. And there's a point in Wolff's philosophical development where he's very positively influenced by these British thinkers in particular. Chapter 2 looks at the development of Wolff's ontology. As I contend, Wolff was influenced by Leibniz's ambition of amending ontology, and so his early forays into this discipline are extremely modest. But I argue that it was the Leibniz-Clark correspondence in particular that convinced Wolff of the need for a more robust ontology at the outset of his metaphysics. So what had been kind of a marginal interest for Wolff previously becomes foregrounded with the German metaphysics itself. And then chapter 3 considers Wolff's contributions to psychology, cosmology, and natural theology in the German metaphysics, showing how specific doctrines connect with and develop Wolff's earlier treatments of these topics. And then at the end, I defend Wolff's renunciation of the label Leibnizian Wolffian philosophy for his system, right? So there's a kind of originality that I think we have to accord to Wolff, and we have to take his rejection of this label at face value. With this detailed account of Wolff's metaphysics in hand, the focus of the study in part 2 shifts to the impact of and response to Wolffianism. So one chapter that we're not talking about today, at least not specifically, is chapter 4, where I consider what I take to be a widely neglected aspect of Wolff's reception in Germany, namely the striking uptake of his philosophy among women intellectuals. Right, so one line is that one observer notes that there's something like an actual lycanthropy that is broken out among women in the period. There's this kind of real interest in Wolff that has been stoked. And this is partly because of the accessibility of Wolff's system, its kind of elemental presentation, but also because it's written, of course, in the vernacular that made these modern philosophical views accessible for the first time to a female audience. So when I look in particular at Louisa Gottsched and Johanna Charlotte Unser and their attempts to defend and develop the Wolffian philosophy, particularly with an eye towards making it more accessible to a female audience. In chapter 5, I turn to the main matter of this part, which is providing an account of the intellectual commitments of the foundation of Halle pietism. The principal contention of this chapter goes beyond an acknowledgement of the movement's historical importance to assert that the pietists succeed in elaborating a systematic, coherent, and compelling philosophical alternative to Wolffian metaphysics, one that developed organically from a core set of commitments common to the major thinkers of the tradition. And here in particular, I focus on Joachim Lange, who I contend succeeds in outlining for the first time in Germany a comprehensive metaphysical perspective that proceeds on the basis of a foundational commitment to the freedom of the human will. Right, so Lange is in this way a kind of proto-German idealist, that he takes the will, its spontaneity, its freedom as being the heart of any metaphysics. And I show that this has roots in Lange's pre-Wolffian treatments of philosophy, and that this aspect of Lange's philosophy is just foregrounded in the debate with Wolff that ensues. And then finally, in part 3, which comprises chapters 6 through 9, the focus is narrowed to specific topics in metaphysics. And here I just offer a kind of sample of some of the discussions that proceed from this, proceed after this controversy, and I follow roughly the order of Wolff's topics of metaphysics. So chapter 6, right, looking at ontology, considers the debate relating to the principle of sufficient reason between Wolff and the Thomasian pietists. Chapter 7 is a topic in empirical psychology, takes up the ensuing debate concerning Wolff's doctrine of sensation. Chapter 8, rational psychology, considers the discussion of the soul's immortality. And then chapter 9, taking up themes in cosmology and natural theology, considers the legacy of Lange's charge that Wolff's system is guilty of a partial Spinozism. And in chapter 9, I kind of suggest a connection with the later pantheism controversy as well. So in each of these cases, a similar approach is taken. I isolate a contentious metaphysical issue and show the contrasting positions of Wolff and his pietist opponents. Then I consider the immediate reception of that debate among thinkers within the broader Wolffian and or pietistic traditions. And finally, I show how some thinkers who engage with this debate adopted a variety of strategies for resolving the apparent tension between Wolff, the Wolffian and the pietist views, right? And that they also develop novel metaphysical positions of their own as a result of this engagement. Right, so in this way, what I'm trying to do is to illustrate how, in spite of the unilluminating polemics, the controversy between the Wolff and the pietists nonetheless served as the indispensable frame for metaphysical inquiry, right? That it inspired and shaped discussion and innovation among German thinkers in the first half of the 18th century, right? So apart from the polemics, apart from the the back and forth between Wolff and Lange and Buddha and whomever, right? There's a real fertile space for metaphysical innovation and exploration that's opened by this fracture between Wolff and the pietists. And that's the end. This is a painting of the of Wolff's return to Halle after the ascension of Frederick the Great. I couldn't use it for a cover though, because Michael Walschutz used it for the cover of his recent book. But here in the carriage, I presume, is where Wolff is as he's crossing the river back into Halle. Okay. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Corey, for this very nice presentation of the main points and the structure of the book. I will introduce now Pier Paolo Betti, who is the first commentator. Pier Paolo is a PhD candidate here at the University of Leuven, who will very soon defend his thesis on Kant's conception of monadology in a dialogue with the German metaphysical tradition. And among his recent publications, I would like to mention Kant's mature account of monad as objects in the idea, published last year in the Southern Journal of Philosophy. And he will focus on the first three chapters, or maybe on the chapter 3 mainly. So Pier Paolo, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Manuel, for your kind introduction, and thanks to the organizers and to my colleagues for the invitation to this to respond to Corey Dyck's book. And of course, last but not least, congratulations, Corey Dyck, for the publication of your book. I truly enjoyed reading it, so I learned a lot from it. And more generally, I believe your work marks a significant milestone in Wolff studies, as it sheds new light not only on the complexity and originality of Wolff's thought, but also on the profound impact that the German metaphysics especially had on several intellectual debates in the first half of the 18th century, and also on a number of lesser known figures of 18th century German philosophy. So before moving on to my questions and remarks, I would like to outline what I consider to be the three main prejudices regarding Wolff's philosophy that you successfully dismantle in the third chapter, and more generally, I would say in the first part of your book, so chapter 1, 2, and 3. So I believe the first prejudice you effectively challenged is the idea, and you mentioned this in your introduction, is the idea that Wolff was merely a systematizer of Leibniz or Leibnizian philosophy. As is well known, and you mentioned these in your book, these views already existed in Wolff's own time, but it gained particular traction throughout the 18th century, but also in the 19th century. So it was repeated by Hegel, and then also it is repeated in 20th century books on the history of philosophy. So as you mentioned, while it is true that Leibniz was one of the primary influences on Wolff's thought, I think you convincingly demonstrate that one, Wolff was also influenced by other figures, such as Boyle, Newton, Locke, and perhaps even more importantly, Zirnhaus. And second, that given these other influences, Wolff often read Leibniz through the lenses of these other figures. And again, Zirnhaus in this sense plays a central role. And I think just to mention it, it is still an understudied figure for the development of 18th century German philosophy. As a result, you claim Wolff did not simply repeat Leibniz's ideas, but reinterpreted, distorted, and sometimes rejected fundamental tenets of Leibniz philosophy. So the second prejudice that is still alive nowadays, I would say, is that Wolff was a full-fledged rationalist. And again, I think you nicely showed that this is not true, because Wolff gave a lot of importance to experience, also in view of his method, but also in specific disciplines such as psychology and cosmology. And third prejudice, as you say, that there is this view that the German metaphysics is a work that emerged out of nowhere, right? So since Wolff didn't really devote too much attention to metaphysics before the German metaphysics, it seems that the German metaphysics again appeared out of nowhere. And I think that in this sense, you nicely pointed out that the themes and arguments that Wolff addresses in German metaphysics are rooted in his earliest writings, and so they are connected to earlier reflections. And so I think I really appreciated this. So in a way, my questions and remarks are intended to push you further on some of these points. So the first remark, or the first question, let's say, the first question concerns the motives as to why Wolff rejected the label Leibnizian Wolffian philosophy. So again, in the concluding section of chapter 3, and you mentioned this in your introduction, you explicitly discuss why Wolff rejected this label. And you highlight 2 points. One, again, the influence of other authors. So again, Wolff knew, of course, that he drew on many other authors beside Leibniz. And second point that you mentioned is the fact that Wolff's intention in writing the German metaphysics differed from Leibniz. And more specifically, you say that in the German metaphysics was primarily concerned with finding a real definition of the soul and determining the essence and attributes of God. In this sense, again, you conclude, Leibniz's determination of the fundamental force of monads as a force of representation and his idea that pre-established harmony is based on the harmony between the perception of all substances in the universe were not central for Wolff's purposes. In consequence of that, you say Wolff adopted an agnostic stance towards these doctrines. So simply they were not relevant for him. So while I agree that these may be 2 of the main reasons why Wolff rejected being labeled a Leibnizian, I believe his agnosticism towards these central Leibnizian doctrines testify or is a sign of a dissatisfaction with another aspect of Leibniz philosophy, and namely is science of dynamics. So in chapter 2, you briefly note that as early as his correspondence with Leibniz, so before writing the Deutsche Metaphysik, Wolff was already interested in the details of Leibniz's science of dynamics. So in the correspondence, Wolff actively engaged with Leibniz on this subject. He asked him several questions about the details of his science of dynamics. And in particular, Wolff was not very satisfied with how Leibniz derived derivative forces from primitive forces, right? And so he asked him several questions about this. Leibniz replied, but in the end, Wolff was not really convinced by Leibniz's account. So it seems to me that the very problems Wolff encountered with Leibniz physics as early as in the early years of the 18th century are what led him to distance himself from the doctrine of monads, the theory of pre-established harmony, and ultimately from identifying himself as a full-fledged Leibnizian. For instance, in a passage from the Anmerkungen, so the annotations to the German metaphysics, Wolff claims that it is the impossibility of deriving the force of resistance from the alleged force of representation of simple substances that made him, and I quote Wolff, reluctant to accept the monads of Leibniz. So again, this is the core, it seems to me, of Wolff's critique of Leibniz monadology. So his dissatisfaction, again, with Leibniz dynamics. In other words, I wonder whether the tension between Leibniz dynamics and, on the other hand, Newtonian mechanics should have been given more space in your book, as it clearly constitutes one of the central preoccupations of Wolff's early reflections. So this is just one remark. So this point leads me to my second question, which concerns the role of cosmology in Wolff's German metaphysics. So in your book, you repeatedly emphasize the central role played by rational psychology and theology in the German metaphysics. And you claim, and I quote, empirical psychology and cosmology derive their importance largely from what they contribute to the topics that are Wolff's principal focus in the Deutsche Metaphysik, namely those within rational psychology and theology. So to paraphrase, you believe that, you think that rational psychology and theology are of primary importance, and then cosmology and empirical psychology are kind of derived from these other disciplines. And indeed, you have textual support for claiming this, since in the opening paragraph of the section titled Von der Welt, Wolff presents his cosmological reflections as a detour needed to arrive at a better understanding of the essence of the soul. As you remark, however, the section on cosmology deals with other important subjects, such as the doctrine of bodies, the doctrine of motion, and the laws of motion. In my view, Wolff's treatment of these points is of extreme importance, and specifically because in the first part, for example, of the German physics, so not the German metaphysics, but the German physics published in 1723, so 3.5 years, 4 years after the German metaphysics, Wolff opens his book with a discussion of the nature of the body and its qualities, and constantly refers back to the cosmology section of the German metaphysics to support his claims. So it seems to me, or based on this, don't you think that despite Wolff's own presentation of his own cosmology, the cosmology section of the German metaphysics played a crucial role in his philosophical trajectory, insofar it is there, so in the cosmology section, that Wolff laid the ground for a metaphysics of body that, in his view, was better suited to accommodate the novelties of modern mechanics. So again, to go back to my previous question, to kind of offer a reaction to Leibniz dynamics. So this would be my second question. Finally, my third question concerns the relationship between the German metaphysics and a closely related text, namely the Anmerkungen that I already mentioned. So since the focus of your book is the German metaphysics, I was kind of expecting a more comprehensive treatment of the Anmerkungen. So the Anmerkungen were this kind of series of annotations or a sort of commentary that, of course, you know this very well, or everyone knows this very well. Wolff published as a response to the accusation he had received from people in Halle, so in 1724. And it is, again, a series of annotation. But despite being almost as long as the German metaphysics itself, the Anmerkungen, it seems to me, has historically received and continues to receive very little attention. Arguably, this is partially Wolff's own fault, because he sometimes presents them as, again, mere commentary or mere explanation of what he already established in the German metaphysics. However, in the preface to the third edition of the German metaphysics, so published in 1725, Wolff refers to the Anmerkungen. He says, well, he affirms that writing this annotation give him the opportunity to reflect on a number of topics, and I quote, to expand so Wolff's doctrines with several new additions. So it seems that there is something new in the Anmerkungen that is not fully explicit in the German metaphysics. So my first question related to this would be, what is then the relationship between the Anmerkungen and the German metaphysics? It is simply a clarificatory text. There is something new in it. And then second question related to this, and this is just out of curiosity because I don't know the answer to this. What was the kind of reception of the Anmerkungen? Were they read at the time? Were they influential, or people simply focused on the German metaphysics and disregarded the Anmerkungen to the German metaphysics? So these are my questions. But again, thank you for your book, and I recommend everyone to read it and to buy it. And thanks again.
Great.
Thank you very much, Pier Paolo, for those very interesting and well-informed remarks. So I have about, I think, 5 minutes to respond. So I'm not going to be able to do justice, I think, to some of your more detailed questions, but maybe I can just use this opportunity to give a sense of some justification for some, I suppose, of the decisions I made in the book in terms of what I focused on. I mean, so you're right about Wolff's discussion with Leibniz in the context of their correspondence, where he kind of draws the line at the posit of these peculiar monads with primitive forces as grounding a kind of account of derivative force. I think it's possible that it goes along the way that you say, which is that this is a kind of a key distinction between Wolff and Leibniz, and that really, when it comes to denying or rejecting the label of Leibnizian Wolffian philosophy, that could possibly be driven by differences in terms of what's required in order to have a kind of complete science of dynamics. I suppose my view on that, I mean, I'm not saying that that's wrong. I think it's quite possible. But I think my view on that is that rather what comes to the fore in that letter in particular is a methodological difference between Leibniz and Wolff, rather than a kind of doctrinal difference. right? So Wolff just doesn't seem the need to posit such a thing in order to account for the physical phenomena, right? And I think that this draws attention to a broader methodological difference between Leibniz and Wolff, which is, for instance, or a set of methodological differences, which is, for instance, the priority of experience, of experiment, of scientific investigation. And so one instance of this elsewhere is when Wolff, for instance, takes issue with Leibniz's use of the hypothesis of the pre-established harmony to demonstrate the existence of God. And for Wolff, that's a kind of illicit use, an illicit inference from something that is not known with certainty, right? So so it's quite possible that it goes the way that you say. If that's the case, then I think that's further evidence for why Wolff is right in rejecting this label, that it points to an actual foundational disagreement between the two. But I actually think of just pointing out rather a difference in terms of methodology, a philosophical methodology that exists between Wolff and Leibniz. So that's by way of the response to the first question. The second concerns the cosmology, and here I think is maybe where the biggest clarification of my approach is perhaps helpful. Is that I think that there's no question that cosmology becomes a very important doctrine for Wolff in successive editions of the German Metaphysics, and of course in the build up to the publication of the full dress Latin presentation of the Cosmologia Generalis. But it's what I think is interesting is this moment in 1719, 1720, when cosmology is a kind of secondary concern for Wolff. It hasn't yet kind of taken on a full-fledged discipline in its own right, and it's really only of interest for Wolff, like empirical psychology, insofar as it contributes to the more important aims of the German metaphysics, namely the real definition of the soul and the demonstration of the existence and nature of God. But in the end, my whole perspective, at least in these three chapters, is rather more backwards looking than it is forward looking. And so as a result of this, I leave out a lot of stuff that that one can talk about in a lot more detail, right? So the development, for instance, between the German metaphysics and Wolff's later Latin presentation, for instance, in general is something that I'm not saying that Wolff's metaphysics remains static in the interim. I think there's a lot of developments, and certainly cosmology is one particularly important site of these developments. But I guess, so the point that I'm trying to make is that I don't take the German metaphysics as it is in, for instance, edition 3 to be the kind of end station, and that's where Wolff stops, and everything we know about Wolff's metaphysics in general, we have to unfold from that. But I think there's still development in Wolff's views after the German set of texts, and that's something that should be explored as well. But focusing on that, I think would detract from the point of my analysis, which is to try and show the wider context for the German metaphysics and try and appreciate the text, I think the early text in its own right. Yeah, and then on your third question, I guess this is a response might be similar. The Anmerkungen, I think, is very important. It's a text that is one of the most important texts in the Pietist controversy, right? So it's not really a self-standing text on metaphysics, even though it offers a number of clarifications of certain Wolffian views that in response to certain Pietist critiques of the German metaphysics and other texts by Wolff. But it's very much a creature of that dispute, I take it. And it's certainly worthy of exploring. There's certainly interesting differences and developments from the German metaphysics to the Anmerkungen. But again, it's more of my backward-looking contextual approach to the German metaphysics that means that I assign it less significance, but also because of the fact that I'm rather less interested in the actual text exchange in the Pietism controversy than I am in the kind of wider impact of that controversy on philosophers in the period after the German metaphysics. Yeah. But maybe I should also just take the opportunity to highlight too, I think when you're talking about the third prejudice, that you take my book to dispel, this idea that that the German metaphysics arises kind of fully formed out of Wolff's head in 1719 as intended to be, just as be all and end all treatment of metaphysics. And I think that you're right to emphasize that, because I think that is something of a prejudice, and that a lot of historians of philosophy look at the German metaphysics as if it's supposed to have the Wolffian answer to every question. But really, my point is that this is not at all Wolff's intention, that it's actually a very narrowly circumscribed text that has specific aims, right? Specific questions that it's trying to answer that have bothered Wolff ever since he started thinking about philosophy. And that the aims of Wolff's metaphysics are actually much more modest than they're typically taken to be. They become much more ambitious, right? But it's notable that at the point of the German metaphysics, Wolff doesn't actually talk about psychology. He doesn't talk about cosmology. He doesn't talk about natural theology as distinct disciplines, right? He says von der Welt or von der Seele. But he's not intending this as a kind of complete presentation of metaphysics, right? Despite the full title that said it's rational thoughts on God, the soul, and everything else in general. But I think the aims of the text are rather more modest, and it's a matter of, I think, focusing on what the specific aims are and looking at the context that gives rise to them, that I think we get a better appreciation of Wolff's actual contributions.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your answers.
Yes, thank you both of you for this exchange. We're gonna move now to the next commentator, Tinka Prunea-Bretonet, who is a researcher at the Department of Philosophy at the University of Bucharest. And she has also worked extensively on Kant and German philosophy in the 18th century. And among her recent publication, I would like to mention her recent book on Kant's Metaphysics, L'avènement de la métaphysique kantienne, prémices et enjeux d'une réception au XXe siècle, published by Garnier in 2023. And if I understood well, she will focus mainly on chapter number 5 of Cory's book. So Tinka, please.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. I'm very happy to be here. And I want to congratulate Cory too for such a great book. Very, very useful, and which brings a lot of new elements to the research on the German Enlightenment, and a lot of new information, and it will, I'm sure it will change and advance the research on the German Enlightenment. Indeed, I will focus on chapter 5, on Wolff's impact on the Pietist response, namely. And the chapter is titled The Abuse of Philosophy, Pietism and the Metaphysics of Freedom. In this chapter, as you briefly mentioned, Cory, the main topic is the let's say, Wolff's impact on the Pietist movement in general, and namely on Lange, who expands and refines his metaphysical thesis into a coherent and original system. Cory argues here that the Pietist movement in general, so it's an umbrella term, but the Pietist thinkers in general are not anti-philosophical nor anti-rational in general, but that they provide this metaphysical system that is elaborated in response to Wolff's philosophy. This chapter shows how Pietism was not thought from the very beginning against philosophy, but rather criticized the abuse of philosophy in the theological faculty and in general for the students. Cory pushes back here against the familiar narrative that has been, let's say, taken up over and over again. The familiar narrative that states that the Pietist controversy is based on these personal rivalries, and that mainly Pietist philosophers were not good philosophers, right? Not sophisticated, that they didn't understand Wolff very well, that they didn't provide before Crusius a proper response to Wolff. And this narrative was first criticized by Bruno Bianco, right? And Cory develops in line with Bruno Bianco, but offering more information and a thorough analysis of Lange's position. He develops this idea that actually the Pietist movement, the Halle Pietism, more specifically, was influenced by philosophical figures, the same ones that influenced the program of the Enlightenment and the early Enlightenment, that it was not an anti-intellectual movement, but provided a specific take on metaphysical theses, and successfully elaborated several doctrines, among which Cory focuses here on Lange's doctrine. And their philosophical convictions are sophisticated and coherent and subtle, right? And they did, here again, the focus is on Lange. They did understand Wolff and interpreted him correctly and responded to his philosophical thesis. Corey details here, so the chapter has 3 sections. The first one focuses on Spener, on Franke, and on their understanding of the concept of abuse in philosophy, right? Corey shows how their, let's say, hostility towards philosophy was not directed against philosophy in general, but against 2 pitfalls, namely the study of philosophy to the detriment of the study of theology and scriptures. So devoting too much time to the study of philosophy as such and not focusing on scripture and on inner life. This is one point of one aspect of their understanding of abuse in philosophy. And the second one is a kind of let's say, search for vanity and superficial learnedness in philosophy that cultivates a certain number of biases and effects that go against internalizing God's word. So philosophy is not as such opposed to theology or to the study of scripture, but it is opposed to this kind of attitude that nourishes vanity and self-love. The sections on Spener and Franke offer very significant and helpful and many new, for me at least, historical details on their lives, on their activity, on their doctrines as well. And I would like to mention here the emphasis put on living faith, on the spiritual conversion, on this experience of a personal, I would say, relationship to God. That is not that is specific to this Halle pietism. What was also new to me was, and very interesting, was Spener's views on eschatology. And this is a bit, if the other, let's say, shifts in focus on repentance or on the death of the old man and so on are specific and traditional Christian tropes that find a new light, let's say, in this movement. Spener's eschatology is less traditional, at least to my knowledge. Namely, he's convinced that the change in the heart and the change in our let's say the purification of the corruption he finds in all the 3 states of the church. This purification is meant to bring about on earth a 1,000-year reign of Christ. So on earth, and it's not directly related to the afterlife or to our salvation, but it is supposed to bring 1,000 years of Christian reign here. We see that we are rather far from it. But at least Spener is hopeful, and this is the main aim of his spiritual learnings, or maybe not the main, but at least a very important one, which is rather original to my knowledge. So this is section 3, and Corey also shows that their view on the abuse of philosophy and their treatment of philosophy in general, Spener's and Franke's, are deeply rooted in their spiritual and religious convictions. Section 2 offers an analysis of Joachim Lange's Medicina Mentis from 1704, which, according to Corey's thesis, is the sole, I quote, sole self-standing philosophical work of broad ambition within the Spener-Franke pietist tradition. And Corey analyzes the way Lange provides an analysis of the human faculties, of the tools to change our thinking and acquire the right thinking, the tools to fight against prejudice, and so on, and in general to heal the present diseased state of human mind. And we have two main tools. According to Lange, the natural light that should be cultivated through education and study and so on, a natural light that affects also the will, not merely the intellect. And the second very important tool that's specific to Lange is the supernatural light that is supposed to accomplish this healing of the corrupted state of man through a threefold effect, namely illuminating the mind, inflaming the mind and purifying it, and the third, instilling the motivation to search for the good and the true. Lange understands the supernatural light as the unmediated influence of God upon man through grace. And I will have a question related to this too, Corey, after I briefly present the third section. And this, the intervention of supernatural light is meant to bring about, to maintain, to nourish the active living faith that involves both the will and the understanding. And this is the Lange's contribution to the tradition of modern logic that, as far as I can see, goes far, has very long, let's say, a very long impact, as I noticed similarities with Johann Michaelis Seiler's logic in the 1780s and his later Glückseligkeit. So it's not only Thomasius, but Lange himself that has this very long impact, and this is why the section is very important too. Among other, of course, it's a self-standing interest in Lange. The section 3 is perhaps the most interesting one, at least for me, as it offers examination of Lange's metaphysics of freedom. Based on Lange's earlier theses defended in the Medicina Mentis that are expanded and refined through his controversy with Wolff. And this is perhaps the main aim of the chapter, to show how Wolff's thought and let's say criticisms and influence Lange's own thought, or at least determine him to elaborate further his own intuitions that are rooted in deep religious, spiritual convictions, right, and philosophical convictions. So it is not, and this is the main merit, perhaps, of the chapter, that it fights back against this view that Lange was merely, I don't know, envious or whatever towards Wolff. Right. In fact, Corey shows that his rejection of Wolff's thesis are rooted in this coherent, refined, sophisticated spiritual and philosophical thesis. What is perhaps very important here is that Lange has an original philosophical metaphysical doctrine, one that Corey regards as the most significant one among this tradition, the Pietist tradition, which is original also with respect to Luther, through the emphasis on free will, on freedom in general, and also through the emphasis on another Christian trope, the synergy between, for our salvation, the necessary synergy or collaboration between man and God. So it's not only man, it's not only God, but the collaboration of our free will and efforts with God's grace and action that brings about salvation. I won't go into the details because they are very interesting, but sophisticated too, of Lange's conception of freedom. Just mention perhaps that he has a negative part of his metaphysics where he criticizes Wolff, but he also has a positive one, a coherent and robust positive metaphysics of the freedom of the will that involves also the freedom of the movements of the body and the contingency of events in the world. So his deep mobile is not his hostility against Wolff in elaborating this metaphysics of freedom, but spiritual and philosophical conception that is focused on practice and not theory, on the spiritual rebirth, and on living faith. And I will quote Corey here: the root of the opposition between, this is the conclusion of the chapter, the root of the opposition between the pietists and Wolff can be found in the fundamental differences regarding the relation of philosophy to theology and the revealed truth, the priority of theory over practice, the reality of the natural world, and the differences between the natural world and the human being. And we can see Corey emphasizes this, that the impact of the controversy as such, not of Wolff alone, not of Lange alone, but of this controversy as such was shaped actually the decades to come in the German Enlightenment. What I would like perhaps to point out very briefly is the significance of this rehabilitation of pietism, of Lange, namely, who was, I agree with Corey that he was the most sophisticated and interesting thinker. And this rehabilitation started with Bruno Bianco, was left a bit developed right after him, and it's very precious for our understanding of the Enlightenment. What is also important perhaps to highlight here is this impact of Lange's Medicina Mentis up to the end of the Enlightenment, also on the Catholic logics, right? Not only Wolff's impact or Thomasius, but also Lange's impact on logics in the decades to come. Another contribution, a point that I very much value here in this chapter is that it offers a tool to distinguish between the Thomasian and the Pietist school, right? As much as we see Leibnizian, Wolffian philosophy, we also see that colleagues who named this the Thomasian Pietist school or Thomasian Pietist tradition. And Corey shows here through Lange's example and this theory of the supernatural light, for instance, that there are two different traditions, right? The Thomasians on the one hand and the Pietists. Crusius perhaps is a kind of mediating figure, but there are conceptual tools to distinguish between these two, right, that are unjustly put together to my view. Perhaps I would have 2 or 3 small questions and one bigger one, and one that is bigger. First of all, Corey, if you, maybe it was not the place, let's say, within a chapter on the metaphysics of freedom, but I didn't quite get if Wolff's conception of method influenced Lange or not. It seems that he either was ironical and just mentioned superficial Wolffian logical concepts, right, or mathematical concepts, or that he really was influenced. This remained unclear to me. What I would perhaps also mention is the absence of Budeus. I'm wondering, I know you could not speak about everybody, but at least perhaps mention or tell us now whether Budeus is significant for Halle's pietism of the time, and does he offer a doctrine that is important if you argue that Lange is the only one, right, to offer such a robust philosophical response? And perhaps the most important point that it's more like a suggestion for the future, for a future article or so, is actually Lange's impact on Wolff. I think it's very important. It would have been perhaps interesting here to learn a bit more, but if not in a future text. So there is an impact of Wolff, which you see more like an occasion for Lange to refine his doctrine, right? Or to understand how important his conception of freedom, already mentioned in the Medicina Mentis, is for that metaphysical, let's say, conceptions of the time, right? So Wolff is more like an occasion and for him, because he already has this thesis briefly mentioned in the Medicina Mentis. Now he expands them and refines them. But I think that what is also very significant and important for these first 50 years is Lange's influence on Wolff himself, not only in the controversy text, in the responses to the pietists, but mainly, I would say, in the Marburg hours. Right. So perhaps this would be my main question, and then I have smaller ones, but I was already too long. Thank you.
Thank you, Tinka. Coris?
Yeah, thanks, Tinka, for that sympathetic summary. I think you caught all of the most important things, and for those interesting questions. I will begin my response with a confession that I'll just because I regard you all as friends in the room. But this is actually my favorite chapter of the book, and it's probably going to be the springboard for some future research on the philosophical impact of the Lutheran traditions in Germany. So let's see. I guess one thing I wanted to highlight, just to kind of pick up one of the points of emphasis that you already indicated, Tinka, is just how I mean, what a terrible place we are in the history of philosophy, where we have to argue that the pietists are actually reasonable people, that they actually had a kind of considered position on certain philosophical as well as theological matters. And a lot of work, not just my own, but a lot of work that's been done recently by people like Kay Whitmer, Hun Vermeulen, has shown the kind of the scientific and intellectual commitments and impact of the pietists. That Franca's institutes, for instance, were not just sites of education, but also sites of scientific investigation and innovation. And that it's really, when you start looking into the very, kind of the scientific character of these institutions, the mandate they had to explore and innovate, it's quite shocking to look back at the kind of common misconception of pietism as this kind of anti-enlightened, anti-rationalist, anti-reason kind of movement. Right. And so what's interesting is just that the fact that the pietists, Franca, Spener, Lange, were part of the same intellectual network as Wolff and Leibniz, right? Tschirnhaus wrote the kind of the guidelines for the teaching of mathematics at the orphanage. Leibniz corresponded with Franca, nominated him to the Academy of Sciences. I mean, that doesn't say too much though, because Leibniz corresponded with everybody, of course. But the point is that these were, Spener and Leibniz as well were in conversation. And so it's really artificial, this divide between these two. At least in terms of as a way it's usually presented in terms of a kind of intellectual side versus an anti-intellectual side. Okay, so to get to your question, just so I can make the most of my time here. So the influence of the first one concerns the influence of Wolff's method on Lange. That's interesting because I mean, so as you indicated, I take it to Wolff's influence primarily to bring out certain themes that otherwise weren't emphasized as much in Lange's original presentation of his philosophy in the Medicina Mentis. And so I guess I'd have to think about this more. But at least from the perspective of the book, the principal way in which I think Wolff influences Lange is in terms of the presentation of his philosophy. I don't think it changes the actual philosophical method that Lange adopts. Indeed, I don't think it could, given how important things like the supernatural light, this kind of conception of this foundational prejudice and human reason, right, that can only be removed with God's help. I don't know that the kind of methodology that Wolff develops is something that Lange could adapt for his own uses, right? So certainly to some extent it might inform the use of the natural light as Lange envisions it, though I think he's taking more from Thomasius there. But yeah, I think beyond the kind of convenient method of presentation, right? And division into topics and, kind of treating the definitions and the consequences of these definitions. I don't know that Lange substantively is much influenced by Wolff, but I'm of course willing to be convinced otherwise on that. As for Budæus, again, this is highlighting some of the ways, some of the aspects of my treatment, right, where it's a bit lacking in terms of coverage, right? Budæus is certainly an important figure in this period. Others in this room, Paula among them, have written a lot on Budæus and his contributions to philosophy in the period. It was largely because of my focus on Wolff and my interest in Lange as the kind of the spearhead of the pietist criticism of Wolff that I kind of pushed Budæus to the side. But it's really in deference to, I think, his importance to the period. I just didn't think I could cover him well in the time that I would have allotted to him. So certainly I think he's a more interesting figure. I don't mention him much, but I think he's most interesting, in fact, outside of his contributions to the dispute with Wolff. And that just didn't fit into the narrative that I was telling. So my apologies to the Budæus fans in the group. And then lastly, so this is the bigger question you asked, is Lange's impact on Wolff, and I have to admit I hadn't thought about that. But perhaps this actually links up with Pier Paolo's question from the previous round, right? Which is where we'd want to look for the Lange's influence on Wolff in the text like the Anmerkungen, where he's specifically responding. So I think you're right that there's ways in which Lange forces Wolff to clarify, to refine his views, right, in response to challenges. But in terms of a positive impact, I just don't know enough offhand to kind of speculate. Others might be in a better position than me to make such claims, perhaps Matteo, for instance. But I think this would be an interesting field for further research, is what influence Lange might have had on Wolff afterwards. Yeah, so sorry I can't give you anything more substantive than that, than just to kind of underline the importance of that question. I mean, I'm interested. I mean, it's interesting too how you point out to Lange's impact on works in logic later in the period. I do think that there's more to be said about the relation between Lange and Crusius. A lot of the kind of headline doctrines that we find in Crusius, we find already a kind of anticipation of in Lange. I assume that Lange was more important for Crusius in his development and his refinement of his own philosophical views than Crusius lets on. And I think that a lot of the credit, at least some of the credit that goes to Crusius for kind of laying the ground for certain Kantian doctrines or critiques of Kantian doctrines are actually ultimately to be traced back to Lange himself. And it's really just a symptom of the bad reputation that Lange has in the history of philosophy in the 18th century, that he's not accorded his due. And so I think this chapter is just partly by way of rectifying that oversight and restoring Lange to a place of maybe not prominence, but at least coherence, and I think and some importance at the outset of a certain philosophical tradition in the 18th century. Yeah. Okay.
Hey, thank you, Corey and Tinka. We move now to our next speaker and also to the third part of the book, I guess. Our next speaker is Paola Rumore, who is professor of philosophy at the University of Torino. Her work is primarily focused on Kantian and pre-Kantian metaphysics, and among her publications about these topics and these authors, I would like to mention the collected volume Johann Heinrich Lambert, Wege zur Mathematisierung der Aufklärung, published in 2022 by the writer. And Paula will focus on chapter 8, but not exclusively. So Paula, please.
Well, thank you for the introduction, for the kind presentation, and I'd like to join the other participants in thanking Carrie and the organizers for inviting me in the discussion of this important book, which fills a gap, and it's hard to deny, in studies of 18th century German philosophy. My brief commentary is divided into two parts, one more general, relating to the reasons why I believe Corey's volume to be an indispensable resource for the study of modern German philosophy today, and the second part in which, as agreed, I address on a specific chapter, that is the 8th, on Meyer and the immortality of the soul, which is somehow consistent with my own research on the Enlightenment, on the Aufklärung. So kind of biographical incipit. Many years ago, my Dr. Vater, and Tinkas maybe too, Norbert Hinske, at the time one of the most relevant voices in the Kant-Forschung, especially with regard to Kant's relationship to his sources and to the milieu of the German Enlightenment, had rightly made clear the urgency of a systematic study of the decades that precedes Kant's revolution in thinking. A study, however, that was capable of looking at the philosophers of those years in an autonomous way and not necessarily conceiving them as a step towards the birth of critical philosophy. In short, according to Hinske, the aim was to write a prequel to Richard Kroner's famous work from Kant, so von Kant bis Hegel. We had to have a von Wolff bis Kant, a volume that was missing. Attempts in this direction had been made by important scholars. I mentioned just the most famous, Max Wundt, Giorgio Tonelli, Hinske himself, but always in the form of episodic forays through fragments of the philosophy of the Aufklärung. With his new volume, Corey has responded to this urgency by placing the 50 years of influence of the new metaphysical canon established by Wolff's Metaphysics at the center of a reconsideration of the German 18th century philosophy that can open up new research perspectives. As Corey himself explains in the introduction, his work has also emerged through the revision of a series of essays that, while part of a single and unified project, betray their independent origins, so to speak, and necessarily sideline figures and themes that have nevertheless played a role in that history. Buddha, for instance. Nonetheless, the overall picture that the book is able to provide allows for a sharp look at themes and problems in the philosophy, the Wolffian philosophy that was to exercise hegemonic power in Germany in the pivotal years of 18th century. Corey paints his picture incorporating the latest findings of scholarship and transporting an historical systematic approach to Anglophone studies that, with few exceptions, allows for a reassessment of the approach to the history of philosophy that was common in the old world and has been unjustly forgotten. There are many theses in the book I agree with. First and foremost, the claim that Wolff, especially the metaphysical Wolff, was one of the most misunderstood philosophers in the history of thought. Epigon of Leibniz, political enemy for the pietists, theologians, polemical target for Kant, unoriginal systematizer for Hegel, and one can go on. The reassessment of the Cartesian legacy, the presence of Tschirnaus and British philosophy in the formation of his original views contributes to a reconsideration of his main claims, reassessing Leibniz's influence. Beside that, the rehabilitation of pietism through a close examination of the works of its leading figures, from Spener to Franke to Lange, as we've heard from Tinka, restores theoretical dignity to an important part of German culture of the time, which desperately need to be emancipated from the trivializing and misleading image of the obscurantist enemies of philosophy. The feat of viewing the famous controversy with Wolff, ex partibus infidelium, so from the side of the opponents, has only very rarely been endeavored, to my knowledge, only by Bruno Bianco, already many times quoted by Tinka, but in a book from almost 40 years ago, and more recently by Simon Grote. And it certainly represents an important step forward in the attempt to supplement the usual canon of the philosophy of the Aufklärung with elements that have been unjustly neglected so far. In this sense, so in the sense of integrating the canon, I warmly welcome that Corey has included in his volume a chapter explicitly devoted to an account of the ways in which Wolff philosophy was received and promoted by women philosophers, a topic to which Corey has already devoted many efforts in order to promote a necessary integration of the voices that contributed to 18th century German philosophy and to an enrichment of the canon, as I said, to which 2 centuries of masculine narrative in the history of philosophy have accustomed us. The integration of the canon, the rebalancing, so to speak, of the historical weight of Wolff's figure is, in my opinion, the most important contribution of Corey's work, a work that, as I mentioned at the beginning, opens up important new research perspectives. And just to mention one example, the enormous role that Wolff's metaphysics played in a more or less implicit way in the scientific reflections of the time, from the iatromechanical school to the so-called vernünftige Ärzte. In those contexts, one finds, in an often problematic way, the attempt to test the connubium between reason and experience, one of the great points of innovation involves metaphysics, in the frame of the new experimental method, and it's a field that would deserve historico-philosophical analysis. So much for the undeniable merits of Corey's book in general. Now I turn to the more specific part of my talk. I refer to chapter 8, which is devoted, as I said, to the subject of the immortality of the soul, and in particular to the perspective opened up by Georg Friedrich Meyer. Meyer is an interesting figure in that landscape. I myself have sometimes described him as a dissident Wolffian, an avant-garde Wolffian, but as time goes on, his closeness to Wolff seems to me less and less acceptable. As in other areas, Meyer's position on the long-debated question on immortality is very different from Wolff's, although the underlying metaphysical considerations are largely the same. Indeed, several studies, including some important ones by Corey himself, have shown how Meyer questions the possibility of a rational proof of immortality, albeit within an argumentative framework similar to the one of Wolff. Meyer argued that immortality cannot be proven scientifically, it is by applying the deductive method of mathematics, because God ultimately has the power to annihilate even simple substances, and his intentions remain unfathomable to our finite intellect. By denying the possibility of proving the immortality of the soul mathematically, Meyer denied not only one of its possible rational proofs, but the possibility of a rational proof at all. In my opinion, and I would like to hear Corey's idea about that, it is precisely this claim and the possibility to gain a rational certainty concerning the topic of immortality that distinguishes Myers from Crusius' position, even though the two philosophers are often associated. For Crusius, while also recognizing the possibility of a mathematical demonstration of the eternal life of the soul from the metaphysical properties of the soul itself, being it a simple substance, nevertheless, he believes that it is possible to provide a rational proof. The core of Crusius' proof lies in the observation that the pursuit of moral perfection that God has instilled in us would be foolish and futile if our life did not continue beyond that. But God does nothing in vain, so, and so on and so on. For Crusius, this is a rational proof, albeit an exclusively practical one. It has to relate to the exercise of virtues of which rational beings are capable. Myers denies the possibility of a rational proof of immortality qua talis, whether on practical or mathematical level, and instead argues that our belief in immortality cannot exceed the limits of probability. We have more reason to believe that the soul survives the death of the body than that it perishes, and therefore we are justified in believing in immortality, a claim for which, however, we have no certainty at all, no rational certainty at all. And I agree with Corey that at a certain point in the history of philosophy, and precisely with Crusius, the moral certainty we have concerning the eternal life of the soul is no longer a question of high degree of probability, but has a specific moral in the sense of practical character. And we both argue these in that beautiful volume you co-edited with Falk, Wunderlich. But I can't find any textual reference that allow to say that in Maya we find already this switch to a pure moral, let's say, to an authentic moral certainty of that proof. Maya keeps on saying we have a high degree of possibility. We do not have enough good reason to contradict this claim. And this is the first point. Then I have another point that concerns a question I remember we discussed many, many, many years ago, but I didn't find any echo of that discussion in the book. So I go on once again with my question. Meyer, who is an interesting but not the most rigorous thinker, will be persuaded by his friend Lange, the son of the Lange we were talking about a few minutes ago, that there is at least one rational argument for immortality that can give our belief the demonstrative certainty of a mathematical proof. It is the argument of the best of all possible worlds that both Meyer and Wolff accept in their own systems. If this one is the best of all possible worlds, should even one soul perish, it would cease to be the best and give way to another world that would no longer be the best. This withdrawal of Meyer is not mentioned in your book, Corey. Why? It is clear to me that your narrative thread begins with Wolff, integrates his position with Baumgarten's pietistic proposal, and here, once again, it's not very clear to me how come, according to you, Baumgarten overcomes or goes beyond Wolff and the Wolffians in his demonstration of immortality. But okay, this thread reaches Meyer and Crusius with the final turn to the practical nature of the belief in immortality. Nevertheless, if we want to read the history of the Enlightenment not as that of a long preparatory phase for the birth of Kantian philosophy, but rather to recognize its own autonomous dignity in all those smaller figures, let's say, taking Meyer's retreat into account would have some advantages. It would make it possible, for example, to show the strong persistence of a de facto philosophical approach, conditioned by the imprint of the deductive method introduced by Wolff. So a long echo that goes back to Wolff once again. And at the same time, it would have the advantage to show how much the religious implication of philosophical conviction still carry weight 20 years after the affair with the pietists. So I'd like to hear your thoughts on this. And as everybody already said, thanks for the book. It's a great book.
Thanks, Paola, for those great comments. I think both of them are issues that we've been talking about for a long time, and in fact, I was expecting you to take up the issue that is behind your first question. So yeah, on the question of Meyer's status as a Wolffian. So well, first of all, I think that so you're right that in I think the Gedanken. What is it? Von dem Zustande der Seele nach dem Tode, right? In the actual body of the text itself, there's very little discussion beyond his kind of negative point about saying that we can't know demonstratively or mathematical certainty that the soul is immortal or that it enjoys some status after the death of the body. But I guess what I pointed to before, and this is nothing new in the book, is just the significance of the preface of that text, where Meyer does suggest that we have extra rational grounds for accepting the truth of the immortality of the soul. These are grounds that he says are kind of scriptural grounds on the one hand, but he also says that we have reason to believe in the soul's immortality because it's a support of virtue. That is to say, it's something we have to suppose in order to make virtuous action possible. He doesn't go into much detail about it, but there is this just one section where I think he makes this point. And you know, admittedly, I read the rest of the argument through that lens, right? That Meyer is, I mean, and I think this is a perspective that may be unhelpfully informed by the direction this dispute takes after Meyer into Kant. that what Meyer there is doing is showing that while we have, you know, rational grounds to that make the immortality of the soul uncertain, or at least merely probable, there are nonetheless other sorts of grounds that support what I call it a belief in immortality, but it's importantly distinct from the Kantian, or at least less well developed than the Kantian sense of belief. That's my own kind of idiosyncratic reading of that text, I suppose. But to your question, I mean, if we were to understand Meyer in your way, and I think your way of understanding him is helpful because it draws a strict distinction between his view and Crusius's on this matter. I do think actually he looks more Wolffian than less, right? But I got the impression that you were drifting away from viewing Meyer as a Wolffian and as viewing him as something else altogether. I think that the idea that Meyer would say that we have this mere probability in this case, that you know, that he's willing to settle for less than absolute certainty in the context of a philosophical investigation is actually picking up a Wolffian methodological theme, right? That philosophy can make use of hypotheses, that sometimes merely probable opinions can also be helpful, that they at least mark out a domain that we'd want to investigate further. So I don't think that alone is kind of sufficient to distinguish him from the Wolffian school. I think that rather just gives him an interesting place within it. And moreover, I mean, whichever way you take Meyer, I think that it's important to see that the Wolffian school is not this kind of it is not always a kind of dogmatically pure, right? That there's a lot of room for differences and still having figures identified, at least by some, like Ludovici or whomever, as Wolffians. And so there's a lot of, I think, space for discussion, for difference, right? One can even be someone like Knudsen, who takes an unusual position on the ground of the agreement between the states of the soul and the body, and still be identified or identify yourself as a Wolffian. So in the end, what I want to say is that there's the Wolffian intent is broader than it's often presented, that there's not this kind of litmus test to belong to it. But in the end, it's perhaps something general than more general than a commitment to a set of doctrines than it is to a commitment to a kind of philosophical methodology. On the second point, so this is, yeah, I guess I probably have less to say on this that'll be satisfying. I do ignore the Beweis, the later text in which Meyer does offer a proof of existence. I think that text is kind of compromised a little bit. I was at least disappointed when I first read it, especially after the Gedanken and then the Verteidigung. I was disappointed in Meyer's defense, but I do think that he wrote it and published it at a time, I think, when things were politically getting a bit hot for him. And he needed to put something out there that looked like he was not calling this kind of key doctrine into question. And so that at least is my kind of my initial take on it, is that I believe that it's a kind of betrayal, and it doesn't even answer the kind of criticisms that Meyer poses in the Gedanken and in the Verteidigung. And that either Meyer has become a worse philosopher in the interim, or he's publishing this text because he wants to get out of trouble. So I guess that's my view. That's why I ignore the Beweis. But certainly, I mean, again, what's important for me, for Meyer, is just that he says what he does in the Gedanken, and I think that this is a very interesting moment in the history of Wolffian philosophy, and one that turns out to be quite consequential too, because I do think that Kant derives at least some of his views on this from engaging with Meyer. Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Paula.
Thank you, both of you. We'll move now to our last speaker, Reid Winnega, who is Associate Professor of Philosophy at Fordham University, and who works also on the German metaphysical tradition, on Kant, and especially more recently on Kant's philosophy of religion and the question of life's meaning in Kant. And among many other articles, he has published a recent chapter on Kant entitled Kant and Religion in the Oxford Handbook of Kant. Which was published in Oxford University Press, and he will focus on chapter 9. So, Reid, please.
Many thanks to Corey, many thanks to the organizers. Like everyone's already noted in various ways, Corey's book provides a great service to our understanding of 18th century German philosophy. Obviously, in his own lifetime, Wolff's one of the most famous, influential philosophers in Europe. His name's largely absent from our standard introductions to early modern philosophy today. But as people have been noting, as Corey noted, um, his book really considers Wolff's metaphysics and its influence in the detail that they properly deserve, and really treats Wolff as a significant figure in his own right, rather than, for example, just as a follower of Leibniz or a precursor to Kant. So, like everyone else, just want to applaud Corey for all of this. So my comments today are going to focus on the book's ninth and final chapter. Um, if you were paying attention to Corey's presentation with the chapter outlines, he noted it takes up issues in cosmology and theology. But as we'll see, it really does so via the question of Wolff's relationship to Spinoza. So that's kind of the core of the chapter. So I'm going to first proceed by outlining what I take to be central aspects of the chapter, and then I'm going to go on to suggest kind of three further points or further ideas that I'd like to get Corey's thoughts on. So as Corey notes in the book, questions about a potential affinity to the metaphysics of Spinoza's ethics have long hung over Wolff's philosophy. As early as 1721, pastor Volkmar Conrad Poppo had accused Wolff of Spinozism, and such accusations became even more prominent during Wolff's well-known dispute with Lange that we've referred to a number of times today. For instance, Lange argues that Wolff's metaphysics entails necessitarianism, so the world's necessary existence, and fatalism, both of which Lange associates with Spinoza and with some other figures as well. Of course, Lange was aware that Wolff explicitly denied these alleged Spinozistic entailments, that Wolff insisted on the contingency of the world's existence, as well as the existence of divine providence and free will, which Wolff understood in compatibilist terms. But Lange insisted that Wolff was a partial Spinozist. He had some deleterious Spinozistic commitments, and even suggested that many of Wolff's denials were actually dishonest, insinuating at times that Wolff had knowingly advanced doctrines like necessitarianism and fatalism, while duplicitly trying to obscure this fact from readers. However, Corey's main focus in the book's final chapter is not the dispute with Lange per se, but instead Moses Mendelssohn's 1755 dialogues. So the title of the chapter is Moses Mendelssohn and the Ghost of Spinoza. In these dialogues, Mendelssohn considers how the view of Leibniz and the further Leibnizians, which here Mendelssohn clearly takes to include Wolff, relate to Spinoza's metaphysics. For example, in the first dialogue, Mendelssohn argues that Spinoza had initially invented the core aspects of Leibniz's theory of pre-established harmony. Here, Mendelssohn has chiefly in mind the ethics doctrine of a parallelism between mind and body. And according to Mendelssohn, Leibniz had secretly taken this doctrine from Spinoza, or at least it's taken this doctrine from Spinoza, repackaging it as his own theory of pre-established harmony, such that the core of Leibniz's theory of pre-established harmony was drawn directly from Spinoza. Although Mendelssohn does not explicitly discuss Wolff in the first dialogue, Wolff obviously, in the German Metaphysics, endorsed the theory of pre-established harmony between the mind and the body. As people in this room know, there's a lot of discussion about Wolff's level of commitment to the pre-established harmony in the context of the ongoing dispute with Lange, and maybe for Wolff it's less central than for Leibniz or other figures, but in any case, he obviously endorses a version of it to some extent. And so it seems likely that Mendelssohn also has Wolff in mind here. As such, Mendelssohn suggests a level of continuity between Spinoza's metaphysics and Wolff's own. However, Corey notes that Mendelssohn was hardly the first person to recognize a similarity between Spinoza's parallelism and Leibniz's pre-established harmony. Rather, Lange had previously noted this similarity in his own earlier dispute with Wolff, and it seems likely, not certain, but likely, that Mendelssohn knew this. And so Corey suggests that Mendelssohn seems to have quietly borrowed from Lange, just as Mendelssohn thinks Leibniz had quietly borrowed from Spinoza. In the second dialogue, Mendelssohn argues that Leibniz and Wolff's metaphysics is closer to Spinoza's monism than one might initially think. To justify this claim, Mendelssohn develops an idealist interpretation, or I think it's probably better to say reinterpretation, of Spinoza's monism. According to this interpretation, the world, so what Spinoza is going to call natura naturata, is simply an idea in the divine mind. Mendelssohn describes this idealist view as a refined pantheism, and for people familiar with the pantheism controversy, Mendelssohn returns to this refined pantheism there, which is about 30 years after the text I'm talking about. And he proposes that this refined pantheism differs only slightly from the Leibnizian's position. So to see this, note that Wolff takes God's ideas of all possible worlds to derive from God's consideration of the ways in which the divine attributes can be limited and the ways in which those limitations can then be combined. As a result, Mendelssohn claims that the difference between Spinoza's monism, which regards modes as limitations of the divine attributes, and Wolff's own view is slight, consisting, Mendelssohn claims, mainly in the fact that Spinoza identifies the world with the idea of the world in God's mind, while Wolff takes God to have gone on to create a world that perfectly conforms to this idea. However, in contrast to critics like Lange, Mendelssohn suggests that this difference between Spinoza, again, better to say Mendelssohn Spinoza, and the Leibnizians, including Wolff, is only a minor one that doesn't bear in any significant way on religious practice and morality. Of course, Mendelssohn's suggestion of a continuity between Spinoza and Wolff might seem slightly odd, given that Wolff wrote an extensive refutation of Spinoza's ethics, really of its first two parts, but still extensive refutation of the first two parts of the ethics. And one might also find it puzzling that Mendelssohn even praises Wolff's refutation of Spinoza. So again, one might find it kind of puzzling that Wolff attempts to refute Spinoza, Mendelssohn praises this refutation, but Mendelssohn's suggesting some kind of continuity between Spinoza and Wolff. However, if I understand him correctly, Corey aims to resolve these potential tensions by emphasizing that Mendelssohn mainly praises Wolff's refutation of Spinoza for its charitable presentation of Spinoza's arguments, which that doesn't need to contradict Mendelssohn's view that Wolff and Spinoza are more continuous with one another than previously recognized, maybe even more continuous with one another than Wolff himself recognized or is willing to acknowledge. Okay, so what I've done so far is I've outlined my understanding of Corey's main positions in the chapter. And so what I want to go on to do now is to present 3 points. I'm not sure if they're comments or questions or points or suggestions, but 3 ideas for us to think about. So the first of these concerns Mendelssohn's idealist interpretation of Spinoza and its relationship to Wolff. So the monism point I was talking about a minute ago. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to note a point that unless I somehow overlooked it, and I hope I didn't, I don't think Corey draws attention to. Namely, in his dispute with Wolff, Lange seems to me to have already observed a similar potential affinity with Spinoza's monism, between Wolff and Spinoza. Lange's version of this point is couched in terms of Wolff's views regarding the soul and God, specifically. Wolff conceives of the divine nature in terms of God's ability to represent all possible things. And he goes on to then try to show that we can demonstrate further standard divine attributes, like, say, God's infinity, from this initial conception of the divine nature, right, in terms of God's ability to represent all possible things. Right? So it's a very intellectualist kind of conception of God's nature, although he does think you can go on to derive further standard divine attributes. However, Wolff also conceives of the nature of the soul in terms of its ability to represent. And so consequently, Lange suggests at various times, sometimes sort of briefly, that Wolff's position might lead people to mistakenly regard souls simply as limitations of the divine nature, and therefore as modes of God. So if God's nature is to represent all possible things, the soul's nature is to be this power of representation, but it's a limited power, then Lange's thinking people might very well take Wolff's position to suggest that souls are simply limitations of God's nature and modes of God. Of course, Wolff insists that souls are created by God rather than counting merely as modes of God. But Lange's point seems to be similar in spirit to Mendelssohn's own, given its suggestion that Spinoza and Wolff both fundamentally regard finite things, in this case the soul, in terms of limitations of God, and then differ only in the fact that Wolff takes, or Lange would probably suggest dishonestly claims to take, God to go on to create finite beings that correspond to these limitations. And so I think this raises the question of whether Mendelssohn's views regarding Wolff's relationship to Spinoza's monism might also have been informed by Lange's prior discussion, the way that Corey suggests Mendelssohn's discussion of pre-established harmony is informed by Lange's prior discussion. Second, Corey notes that Mendelssohn generally aims to show that philosophical disputes amount to verbal disputes. And if I understand Corey correctly, indicates that Mendelssohn primarily takes the differences between Wolff and Spinoza to amount to verbal disputes. So on like page 255 of the text, going on to 256, Corey writes, this allowed the opposition between Wolffian and Spinozan metaphysics to be cast as nothing more than a verbal dispute. But I wonder if that's really the kind of the best way to describe Mendelssohn's view of the relationship between Wolff and Spinoza. So certainly Mendelssohn knows that Wolff disagrees with Spinoza's definitions of terms like substance. Right? This plays a big role in Wolff's refutation of Spinoza, and Mendelssohn's well aware of this. And to the extent that Wolff and Spinoza have different definitions of substance, then certainly that part of the disagreement can be seen as a kind of verbal dispute. But does this mean that Mendelssohn regards all of the differences, even the differences that he's focusing on, between Spinoza and Wolff as merely verbal differences? So personally, it seems to me the difference between this refined pantheism that Mendelssohn ascribes to Spinoza and Wolff's own view is not merely a verbal difference, it's a real metaphysical difference. After all, whether the world is simply an idea in the divine mind, right, that refined pantheism view, or is an entity created on the basis of this idea, doesn't seem to me to be merely a verbal dispute, but a metaphysical one. And I think Mendelssohn's aware of this point. And indeed, we might think that for Mendelssohn, the important point to consider in a philosophical dispute is whether the differences between the two sides bear in any significant way on religious and moral practice. And one way to show that a dispute does not bear in any significant way on religious and moral practice can sometimes be to show that it's merely a verbal dispute, where two people are mainly using different words to describe more or less the same thing. And so I think in many cases when Mendelssohn wants to say disputes are verbal disputes, he's thinking it's just verbal. As such, they're kind of saying the same thing. There's no major difference here that bears on practice. But minor metaphysical disputes might also be such that they don't bear in any significant way on religious practice and morality. And I think that's Mendelssohn's assessment of the case here. It's a metaphysical difference between Wolff and Spinoza. That for Wolff, God has gone on to create something that corresponds to the divine idea in God's mind. But it's not one that Mendelssohn thinks really matters for our daily moral lives or religious practices. Third and finally, Corey's emphasis throughout the chapter is on Wolff's potential similarities to Spinoza. So that's like the real core thrust of the chapter. But Corey also recognizes and notes a few times that Mendelssohn insists on some important differences between Wolff and Spinoza. In particular, Mendelssohn claims that Spinoza mistakenly entangles what Mendelssohn thinks are these relatively innocent doctrines of monism and parallelism with other worrying errors and absurdities, such as the denial of free will and the denial of divine providence. However, Mendelssohn maintains that the specific Spinozistic aspects of Wolff's views, the kind of ways in which Wolff specifically resembles Spinoza, don't lead Wolff into these further errors and absurdities. So Spinoza has kind of tacked on these further errors and absurdities to these other doctrines that Mendelssohn thinks are respectable. I think that noting this helps to bring to the fore a point that Corey doesn't seem to thematize in his consideration of Mendelssohn's reasons for praising Wolff's refutation of Spinoza. Namely, Mendelssohn claims that Wolff's charitable presentation promises to do a better job than more polemical criticisms of Spinoza in convincing Spinozistic unbelievers of Spinoza's mistakes. So Mendelssohn states this, to my mind, pretty clearly, that one of the chief merits of Wolff's refutation is that it's going to be better at convincing unbelievers than other kind of more polemical approaches have been or will be. And why? Well, in Mendelssohn's view, less charitable polemics permit unbelievers to draw the conclusion that Spinoza's critics must not have any good rational objections to his views, and that's why they simply resort to castigating Spinoza rather than providing proper rational criticisms. So although Mendelssohn does think that some aspects of Wolff's philosophy are relatively continuous with Spinoza, he also thinks both that Wolff's philosophy remains free of Spinoza's more problematic conclusions, by what he takes to be problematic conclusions, and also that Wolff's rational refutation of Spinoza promises the best antidote to Spinozistic irreligion. So thank you.
Thanks very much, Reid. I'm still writing down your comments. These are, yeah, very, very substantive, very thoughtful reactions to that last chapter. I confess I'll have to think about them in more detail, but they're really interesting kind of directions to take this. I guess on the last point, just because it's the freshest in my mind, yeah, I think that advantage of Wolff's refutation is maybe not emphasized in that chapter, though I do think I bring it up in my introduction to the refutation of Spinoza that I translate in the early modern German philosophy volume. But you're at least right that that's a missed opportunity, and that's another reason why Mendelssohn might have appreciated Wolff's refutation. On the verbal disputes issue, yeah. I think Mendelssohn prefers, he likes it when he can take a philosophical dispute and account for it in terms of a verbal dispute. But you're quite right, there's going to be cases where that's not possible. And it might be a helpful, it might be an accurate characterization of Mendelssohn's views on this, that when we do have a philosophical view that has problematic implications for morality and religion, right, then there we might have more than a verbal dispute at issue. I guess I'm having trouble putting myself in the mind of when I wrote this particular bit. But I guess I just took it that that whatever Wolff's intentions might have been, the way he proceeds in that refutation of Spinoza, in terms of offering very precise definitions of a handful of key terms, and emphasizing the difference between the Leibnizian Wolffian view on these matters and the Spinozistic interpretation, would have looked obviously to Mendelssohn as something, as a kind of sympathetic way of diagnosing an error and tracing it back to a verbal dispute. So yeah, but I think I'd have to think more about your comments on this score. And I think the same is the case for your first point on this connection that I don't think I did see between Mendelssohn's Spinozistic reconstruction of Wolff and this critique by Lange. I mean, one thing that it does put me in mind of is that is this very peculiar way that Wolff has of characterizing Spinozism in the first sections of the refutation, for instance, right? It's not characterized in terms of monism or necessitarianism as we would ourselves typically characterize Spinoza, but rather the core doctrine for Wolff that he associates with Spinozism is that the claim of the absurdity of creation from nothing. Right, that is kind of the defining characteristic for Wolff of a Spinozistic way of thinking, and that why this might be relevant here is just that it would suggest that the kind of parallels that Lange might be seeing, or the extension of a certain Spinozistic view that Lange might be seeing in the conception of the individual thinking substance, as a kind of, one of the possible ways of representing the world according to the divine mind, it would just have been a non-starter for Wolff. That it's the whole important difference between Spinoza and him, and any reasonable philosopher, is going to be whether you accept the coherence of creation from nothing. So that might be why Wolff might not have taken that seriously, but Mendelssohn at the very least, I mean, I think this is a way of putting it in light of your comments, that Mendelssohn seems to think that there's more there, that Wolff, there's more commonality there, more ground to be concerned that Wolff didn't give adequate consideration to. And so whether Mendelssohn is taking up, yeah, so I mean that makes one think that Mendelssohn is in a way reviving Lange's original criticism and developing it in a bit more detail in light of this doctrine of the intellect of God. Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you, Corey, and thank you to all the respondents for this exchange. We will now open the floor for the Q&A. I guess that we can take still some 20 minutes for question remarks. So please raise your hand or just use the function here in the Zoom, and I will give you the floor. There is a question also in the chat by Dino, but I don't know if someone in the room has a question before. Yes, Clara.
Thank you for the great book and for the very good presentations as well. I learned a lot. I was wondering, especially in light of the first comments on your book, something that I asked myself as well. So you say sort of as an argument that Wolff is not a fully fledged rationalist, that he places a lot of weight on experience. And I was wondering, given the fact that Wolff often refers to a sort of purely inner experience of, for example, the fact that we cannot imagine a contradiction independently of a sense object. And then also two passages at the end of the German Metaphysics that you mentioned yourself in your book, where Wolff suggests that sensations are themselves produced by the soul, whether this is not a sort of more radical rationalism than maybe even Descartes has, because now not even sensation give us something from the outside, but sort of even sensations are innate, so to speak. Yeah, so I was wondering about this claim that he's not a fully fledged rationalist in light of this definition of experience?
Good. Thanks, Claire, for that great question. So I don't think fully fledged rationalist is my phrasing. I mean, I do think Wolff is a rationalist, though that's going to depend on what you take to be criterial for counting as a rationalist. I mean, I would say that somebody, I mean, typically we would talk about whether you accept innate ideas or, whether you have a decided preference for certain as opposed to probable cognition, that these are defining characteristics of rationalism. Also the acceptance of the PSR, right? I think that's probably the better used criterion today. By most of those counts, I think Wolff does count as a rationalist. But what I would say is that I don't think he's the kind of caricature of a rationalist that he's often presented as, at least not in the German metaphysics. Indeed, despite the fact that he has a view about sensation, that they originate in the soul, right? Nonetheless, his broader epistemology is going to attribute a kind of important role of the content of sensation in informing our concepts, right? So while Wolff will have a distinct metaphysical view about what's really going on, there's nonetheless room there for a kind of empirical content that's informing the formation of our concepts and principles. And as you say as well, he has this reference to certain kinds of experience, right, that play an indispensable role for him in his view, and support certain principles that he takes as foundational, like the principle of contradiction, for instance. And in the book, I have a specific reading of what I think is going on with that it's not a kind of mere psychologism, but something a bit more consistent with Wolff's methodology. So yeah, I'm not going to say he's not a rationalist. And if you did, those are the kind of questions you raise about the origin of sensation and all that, I think would be difficult to deal with. But I think it's enough to say that he's not the sort of rationalist he's often made out to be, right? But for the record, I don't think that Leibniz is either, and I don't think Descartes is either, right? And that there's much more of a kind of difference of degrees between these thinkers that are usually hived off in terms of the rationalist and empiricist tradition, respectively, and that there's much more. This is a really kind of artificial division of the camps, right? And then in fact, the discussion in the period didn't follow, in terms of a debate between these two camps in these specific ways, but there was a lot of productive interaction and positive reception on the part of each side, right? So Wolff is reacting and positively receiving doctrines by Newton, by Locke, by Clarke, right? And so I think that really what this is taken to undermine is any kind of principled way is a kind of a caricatured view of Wolff as a certain kind of arch rationalistic thinker. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, maybe I will move to some of the questions in the chat, because I will read Dino's question, because he will be able to see the answer in the recording, even if he's not here. So his question is, in his presentation, Corey said that Wolff was influenced by Leibniz's emendation of ontology. Is ontology here used in a looser sense than Wolff might use it? Wolff is certainly influenced by Leibniz's article on the emendation of first philosophy and the concept of systems from the Acta, but as far as I understand, Leibniz's conception of first philosophy does not correspond to what Wolff would call ontologia or Grundwissenschaft. So the difference in the form of first philosophy would signify another difference between Leibniz and Wolff.
Yeah. So I mean, there's a good question there about how Wolff and Leibniz might have a different sense of what of the definition of ontology. I mean, so here Dino is referencing the ontologia much later, but already that definition is given more or less the same form in the Ariometria Elementae of 1708. So that's a conception of ontology Wolff had very early on too. And so there is a good question about how that might cohere or conform to Leibniz's definition of ontology. But really, I guess the point that I emphasize is rather the emendation of that sort of discipline, right? That Wolff has the same kind of attitude towards a doctrine that provides an account, a definition of the fundamental concepts and principles of not only metaphysics, but also of another set, of all doctrines, of all sciences, of all domains of investigation. That Wolff, and this is quite clear, I provide a lot of evidence for this, that he doesn't think that there's any need to engage in ontology, or at least anything like, you know, the kind of a full dress version of ontology you find in scholastic metaphysical texts. And that what I'm trying to account for in chapter 2 is just how Wolff goes from that very parsimonious view of ontology and the need to engage with it to the full dress form of that ontology at the outset of the German metaphysics. So I concede that indeed they likely do have a rather different conception of ontology specifically, a different definition of ontology, but both seem committed to it being a much more parsimonious doctrine than it has been treated in the past. Yeah.
Okay. So I'll move to Federico's question. Because he's in a library, he cannot use his own voice. Federico, is okay if I pick one of the two questions because we're running a little bit off time. If you say it like this, or
which is your favorite that we're asking?
if you...
Number one.
So
okay.
the first question. The first on a topic often quoted but not present in the book, being the discussion on Wolff's Oratio Decinarum, Philosophia Practica in both its editions. In fact, I agree that most of the chorale, if of a chorale we can talk about, while unhanging might be on the table, orbits around the Deutsche Metaphysics, but the Oratio creates a problematic and fascinating opportunity to accuse Wolff of deism and atheism proxy the Chinese. What role would you attribute to that work, and would you agree with their efforts that this small portion of the Causa Wolffiana might be read as part of a paradigm of the Aufklärung?
Yeah, so I think that's a really fascinating question, and I don't provide much discussion outside of the introduction of the Oratio. But I do think it's an interesting text, certainly for the reception of Confucian philosophy in 18th century Germany and Eastern traditions in general. I suppose, and maybe this is consistent with the tenor of some of my other responses today, is that it's really a kind of strategic choice on my part to focus on the metaphysical issues, just because that's the story, it's the narrative that I want to tell, is the development of these issues in the first half of the 18th century. And so I think that there's all sorts of interesting ethical issues that arise out of the Oratio. It looks from your question that you have a sense that there might be kind of indications of deistic or even atheistic, or that may be adding fuel to the fire. And I think that's probably quite true. But I think that that it's important to recognize that, I mean, for my story anyway, that the kind of initial reaction to Wolff's metaphysics was not inspired by, I think, doctrinal differences, theological differences, this kind of knee-jerk reaction to Wolff breaking a lance for the Confucian tradition, but actual differences in metaphysical views, philosophical views more generally. But yeah, we shouldn't take the fact that I don't take up this discussion in more detail as a way of downplaying its importance. I think that there's other contexts in which it's vitally important, particularly in the context of discussions of Wolff's practical philosophy. But there are in the end strategic reasons why I prefer to focus on the reception of the German metaphysics, and rather than the Oratio among Wolff's pietist colleagues. Okay.
Okay, Matteo?
I joined the speakers in praising Cory's book. I especially like the fact that it considers the development of Wolff's thought, and so it gives a very dynamic, historically refined picture. I think it really goes in the right direction. One critical remark and a question, perhaps, concerning the debate between Wolffians and pietists. As you have mentioned in your presentation, you have tried to rehabilitate somehow the philosophical relevance and respectability of this controversy. And I agree, but I think it can be one-sided, because I think we should also take into account that, so to speak, the regressive effect of Lange's attack the negative impact of this polemic on Wolff, on the Wolffians. And this may have to do with Tinka's question about Lange's impact on Wolff. I think it was mostly a regressive impact, the fact that Wolff and the Wolffians were somehow compelled either to defend themselves or to give up some of their more radical intuitions and ideas and to step back to more traditional positions. And so I think we should also consider this aspect of the controversy. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Timothy. That's very interesting. So that, I mean, that's that Wolff, that may be consistent, for instance, with Wolff adopting a more traditional scholastic form for the presentation of his philosophical system, right? So that this is part and parcel of that regressive impact. Yeah, I hadn't thought about that. I don't know if Tinka, if you had anything you wanted to say or add to that.
You have to think a bit about this, but I believe, yes, that I also have the same feeling as Matteo, but also that there are doctrinal changes in Wolff's own views that are positive too, right? But a bit later, so it takes him the Marburg hours to express them. Yes, in 2931. So I believe, yes, that Lange has a, and now when Matteo was asking the question, I thought of a very important text where Wolff says that actually he is a kind of eclectic, right? That he's a systematic thinker that is also who is also an eclectic, and he tries to go closer to Thomasius and Lange's views. So yes, but I believe that some of these attacks obliged Wolff to let's say make sharper distinction than he would have had otherwise, right? To give up some nuances and but also to refine his views on freedom, as you point out about Lange's system.
Maybe this is a good opportunity for me to actually point out. So I mean, in the introduction, I pointed out that I think one of the reasons why the philosophical significance of this controversy is neglected is because of a low estimation of the philosophical quality of the texts, right? I just presented that. I think it probably is a prejudice that interferes with the appreciation of what's going on in this period. But I don't think that these texts lacked philosophical quality. But I think that it just requires a ton of research, a ton of work to uncover, right, and expose and contextualize what the changes are, what the revisions are, how the debate advances and changes in light of these, in light of the series of criticisms previous. And that's work that Matteo has done, I know, for instance, in connection, I think, with Kant's first antinomy and the account of infinity, right? So there's productive ways of engaging with the actual, you know, polemical texts as well. And there's something philosophically, there's lots philosophically that's of interest there. But I think when I'm talking about an audience that isn't kind of committed Wolffians, but are folks who've heard a lot about 18th century German philosophy, but don't see any reason to read either anybody but Leibniz or Kant, right? One has to find a way to engage those folks as well. And I think the best foot forward for scholars like us is not necessarily, well, you got to read, you know, De Differentia Nexum Rerum, and you know, that's where it all is. Rather, you want to show that, in fact, what the dispute between Wolff and the Pietists inspired was a really kind of innovative, you know, energy and, you know, a lot of different strategies for revising pietistic views or Wolffian views in light of these criticisms. You have people like Meyer, people like Crusius, who are kind of coming up, developing in the kind of space between these two extremes, and developing really interesting views. So that's not to deny that there's philosophical interest in the actual polemical text, but just to say that I think that the philosophical merits and interests of these other figures is more obvious to a certain audience.
Okay, Paula, please go ahead.
Thank you. So I have a question that is for Cory, but also for Matteo and Tinka and those among us who are well acquainted with texts by pietists, theologians, so Lange, Franke, Spener, and so on. I've always had the idea that according to the criticism that the pietists moved against Wolff concerning the nexus rerum fatalis and the denial of the freedom of the will, John Locke would have been a good alternative path they could take, because Locke had a kind of compatibilistic theory of the freedom of the will, especially in the second edition of the essay, where he raises this theory of the uneasiness, that is a kind of determination of the will that allows the intervention of reason that can evaluate to which extent translate the volition in action. And since Locke is, for many other topics, a presence in that milieu, I was asking myself, have you met any hint at this Lockean theory, the theory of the uneasiness or the solution of the problem of the freedom of the will in those texts? It's, so to say, an idea I have, but I have had so far no time to look for it. And when I did, I couldn't find anything meaningful.
I don't know of any offhand.
The other participants?
Have you tried ChatGTP?
Colin had his hand up. Maybe Colin has an idea.
I mean, I don't know that I can't think of any offhand, but I think of a reason why not Locke, which is the specifically Lutheran context that the pietists are coming out of. I mean, if I think about the sort of religious context that Locke is coming out of, there's a more, I mean, it's Protestant, but it's, you know, Calvinist, that kind of context. And if you're coming out of a German Lutheran context and you're concerned about sort of Lutheran theological principles, then you're probably going to try to do something from Luther rather than from Locke. That's just
might be a suggestion. Yeah.
Another consideration is that the actual account of freedom among the pietists is not terribly philosophically sophisticated, right? I mean, so there's hints of it in Spener. Franke has, I think, one line that I could find where he kind of endorses this, and Lange is really the exception and kind of making this a centerpiece of his metaphysics. But even then, it's just kind of purely libertarian sort of freedom. He doesn't take up in any way the kind of potential inconsistencies with other key parts of his doctrine, like the involvement of supernatural grace and these kinds of things, right? He doesn't. So it's something that they obviously Lange, in any case, assigns a certain key value to, but he doesn't seem to engage in much philosophical theorizing about it. He knows what he's against in terms of the Wolffian compatibilist conception, but he didn't seem to think that he required much in the way of filling out his own view.
My last hope is Buddha.
Yeah, well, Buddha would be the one who, if anybody was receptive to Locke on that point, it would be him. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, if there are no other questions, we can maybe conclude the formal part of our session here. I would like to invite you to the last session, to the next session, which is the last of the semester of our seminar, which will be on Hegel philosophy of history, with Professor Richard Bork. So you are, of course, kindly invited. And we are hope that we will see each other in future session of the seminar. So please join me in thanking again Cory, for accepting the invitation, and also the respondents and commentators for engaging with the book, and really for having this nice exchange that we had today. Thank you, Corey, and everyone again.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. This was a wonderful discussion. And thanks for the evident careful attention that you paid to my book and for your very thoughtful responses.